Hello everybody, welcome back to another celebrity face reading. My name is Taylor, and first off I would like to wish you all a very happy All Saints Day. Get your butt in church, get praying, do all that, then come back, watch this video. And today, in celebration of All Saints Day, we will be looking at one of the most famous saints in the Catholic Church, and I'd like to say in Christianity as a whole, one of the very big, very prominent modern day saints, Saint Padre Pio of Italy. Well known for his namesake piety and devotion, but probably most famous for all the many weird, unexplainable miracles that surround him. Most famously, his stigmata. He was covered in the wounds of Christ basically his whole adult life. They came and went, but they were pretty consistent, and scientists are still scratching their heads to this day as to what was up with that. His stigmata was so frequent, actually, the guy had to wear basically fingerless gloves or hand wraps just to keep his spontaneously regenerating nail wounds from bleeding all day. And so I figured, in recognition of All Saints Day, and especially after my last couple videos, which have all been pretty grisly Halloween specials, and after all those devilish diabolical men, I'd like to do a godly man for a change. Let's get right into it. Now we're going to start off with his phenotype, which is the physical expression of his ancestry and genetics. Now I think it's pretty clear that St. Padre Pio was of a pretty strong alpinid type. You see that rounded head, that short skull, short stocky sort of body, short upturned nose, pretty alpinid, a little bit of Mediterranean, but I would say by and large mostly West Alpinid. This is a very common type, especially in the mountains of Italy along that central ridge of the Apennines there, but found throughout all of Italy in lesser amounts, but mostly up north towards the Alps, hence the name, and down through the middle around the Apennines. This is your archetypal European peasant phenotype, and he definitely had it. But he didn't always have it. In his youth, he had a very different look. Similar sort of skull shape, but the facial features were all different. In these pictures, he looks a lot more Armenoid to me. Now, this type is found somewhat in Italy. It's most common in Turkey and in the Middle East, but it's found sporadically in southern Italy, down in Sicily. So I think what happened here was an example of what modern race scientists call transmogrification, wherein genetic admixture from different racial types is not displayed simultaneously, not all at once in one simple mixed type, but rather sequentially, such that one person expresses the type of one parent during their youth, and then as they grow older, they change to another parent's racial type. This is actually a bit more common than you might think, and it can lead to some very interesting transformations over time. You get some guy of mixed ancestry, and in his youth growing up, he looks more like his mother, and then he hits 40 and he suddenly looks more like his father. Race and genetics are way more complicated than you can even imagine, and this kind of stuff just happens sometimes. And I'll be going into more detail about this transformation at the end of the video as well, comparing and contrasting his younger self to his older self, because there was quite a distinct change, not just in race, but in personality as well, which we will get into there. Alright, with his ancestry and phenotype out of the way, we can now get into his physiognomy proper, starting off with his side profile, which will tell us about his temperament and inborn characteristics. He seems to me to be a pretty pure phlegmatic. This means that he was quite visionary. He thought, planned, and acted in the long term with a slow and steady, very reliable and stable sort of energy of action. He was very tolerant and open, and he could endure a lot. He was a spiritual, emotional, and mental tank. He could take on the pains of other people, and it seems maybe even the pain of Christ, and endure it for a greater cause. But he wasn't a pure phlegmatic. He also had a bit of a bow of melancholy. That's that bow shape to the side profile there. That shows a little bit of added sensitivity, reactivity, creativity, charisma, charm, and wit. And so unlike your typical phlegmatic monk that might just be wanting to pray and meditate or just following the dictates of some monastic order, he was very focused on reaching out to people, on speaking, on being sort of creative with his words. And he went out and he inspired millions of people, and is inspiring them to this day with his words and his leading by example as well. Now, with his side profile and temperament out of the way, we can now get into his face shape, which will tell us about his personality archetype and the broad strokes of his personality as a whole. And he's obviously got a pretty short and wide face. I think he's got a mixed face shape here. I think he has elements of the square earth face shape combined with the circular moon face shape. This is a unique hybrid archetype here. Earth and moon together gives us the shaman archetype. Now, they combine the traits of both. So the earth personality is very grounded, practical, realistic, focused on relations and material hands-on things. As you can see, he was a friar, not just a monk. So the difference for those who don't know is that monks like to stay up on a mountain, up in a monastery, and they just pray and do penance, and they focus entirely on God. It's just between them and God. Friars are monks who they're sworn to chastity and poverty and all that, but they are monks who go out in the world and they mission to people. They preach the gospel, they do charity, they want to be out in the world interacting with people. And that was very much Padre Pio's orientation. But the moon elements add some extra sensitivity there, some moodiness, a sort of rhythmic kind of emotional sensitivity and spiritual sensitivity as well. Some added imagination and creativity. I think this probably came out best in his preaching. If he were a pure earth face without that extra circular, round, sort of lunar element, I think he might have been a lot more conventional. He might have just been the kind of person to say, just do what the catechism says, do whatever the Pope tells you, just conform. But he really wanted to reach out and touch the soul of man. And he wanted to do so in a very passionate, creative, convicting sort of way. He focused on the needs of the heart, not just the needs of the belly or the dictates of the mind. So we can end with this earth-moon combination, this shaman archetype, by saying that he was someone who was very strongly rooted in the earth and in people, but very strongly reaching up towards heaven, which is a very powerful combination, pretty much perfect for a friar, I think. Alright, with the broad strokes of his personality out of the way, we're going to go through a few of his facial features, sort of illuminate his style of preaching, worship, and devotion, and how that affected his life. His eyebrows were pretty low set, which means that he was quick to judge, not super discerning. He wasn't the kind of person to need to sit and contemplate things and weigh out all the factors to make a decision. He was quite confident in looking at something, assessing it, and judging it quite quickly. I try not to do too much research on the people I analyze beforehand so as to avoid biasing my analysis, but one thing I did catch while looking for images of this guy was that apparently he decided to dedicate his life to God and become a monk when he was 5. Now, he was from a very religious, super Catholic Italian family, but that's still a crazy thing to commit to and stick to through your whole life when you're 5. But he did it because he had those low-set eyebrows. Now, his eyes are pretty squinty, but I do think they're ultimately protruding. This means that he spoke off the cuff. He was not a super calculated or withdrawn person. He wanted to be socially involved. This is why I think he became a friar and not just a monk off on the top of a mountain somewhere. He wanted to reach out and speak to people, communicate with people, connect with people. He wanted to speak and be heard. In his case, he wanted to speak the gospel and be heard by sinners in need of help and repentance. This is further emphasized by the fact that his ears were very close set. This means that he was conformist dependent. He needed to and was able to rely on his relationships, which was a great boon to him. I think he probably wanted to exist within the context of a community, both his local community of Italians and the global community of Catholics and Christians as a whole. Now, going back a bit to emphasize again these more earthy, practical, friar type elements he has going on, he had quite a short nose. This means that he was practical, oriented towards action rather than thought. Again, he was a friar, not a theologian. If you've got a long, thin nose, go and become Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine, become a philosopher, become a theologian if you want a religious vocation. But if you have a short nose, become a priest, become a friar, become a pastor or a street preacher. Go out and do things in the world. That is how you will find spiritual fulfillment if you feel called to that kind of vocation. Now, on the topic of his nose, another very noticeable feature is that his nose had a very round tip. This shows a lot of kindness and care for other people, great generosity. You can think, of course, of someone who looks quite a bit like him, Santa Claus, which is, of course, a downstream distortion of sorts of Saint Nicholas, another historic saint known for very strong preaching and very intense devotion to Christ and the church. Now, speaking of his preaching, let's look at his mouth, because the mouth tells us about communication, someone's communication style. His mouth is interesting. It's actually pretty small, showing that he was quiet, reserved, kept to himself, even though he wanted to speak and be heard, as shown by those protruding eyes. By nature, he was good just being reserved, but if he felt the need to speak, if he felt like he could help someone by speaking, he would, but he didn't feel an urge to just talk for its own sake. This is further emphasized by the fact that he had pretty thin lips. He wasn't too in tune with his own feelings or emotions, and he wasn't very expressive of those to others, especially with that sun upper lip, that wide arch upper lip shape with no real prominent cupid's bow. He was not much of a smooth talker, not really a seductive, convicting sort of person. He told people the direct, simple truth about Christianity, the gospel, the church. Again, I don't know really what specifically he focused on in his preaching and his outreach work, but that would be my guess. It is really simple, direct, to the point stuff. And all that in spite of these sort of fantastical events that surrounded him in his life. All sorts of miracles, from stigmata to incorruptibility to bilocation. He was in 2 places at once, apparently. Still no explanation for that from the scientists. Crazy stuff going on with this guy, and in spite of that, I don't think he was that fazed by it. Not a super sensitive person, very grounded in both earthly reality, but more importantly in spiritual reality, which is more real than any of this earthly stuff. Alright, with his very famous and iconic older appearance analyzed, I want to take a step back again and look back at his youth and analyze the facial features there. See what changed between his youth and his old age, because there's a very stark difference here, more than I've seen in just about anyone else. He looks like a totally different person, I think, between his youth and his old age. So it's clear that Christ was working some sort of incredible transformation in this guy's life. As I mentioned before, he shifted from Armenoid to Alpinid in his phenotype. Now, although I do think he was still phlegmatic back then, maybe with a bit of a stronger bow of melancholy, he very clearly shifted in his personality archetype from a more Saturn or Mercury face shape to that Earth-Moon face shape. This means that in his youth, he was much more intellectual, much more abstract, much more diligent, focused on work, on sensitivity, on getting attention, on creating something great. But over time, he became a lot more stable, a lot more grounded, a lot more practical, and a lot more focused on other people rather than his own work or intellectual matters. And this is further emphasized by the fact that in his youth, his ears were really wide splayed. They weren't the very close-set ears we see in his older age. This means that he used to be very independent and kind of nonconformist, maybe a bit of a rebel, but over time he learned to conform more and he found a way to fit in with his community and his faith. Now, I mentioned that his eyes were bulging. In his youth, they were bulging a lot more. They're a little more deep set in his older age, so that shows that he became a bit more calculated, a bit more withdrawn. In his youth, he might have been a bit rash in his speech, might have blurted things out without thinking. And one of the more prominent facial feature changes here is his nose. He had a really long nose in his youth, which means that he was very intellectual. He was much more abstract, patient, contemplative, thoughtful. But over time, he became a lot more practical. Like I said, a lot more grounded, a lot more rooted. I get the impression that in his youth, he was seeking a lot intellectually and spiritually. And once he found what he was looking for, which was Christ and the gospel and salvation, not to say that he wasn't saved before, but I think he found a sort of contentment and fulfillment in his vocation and in his spiritual calling as a friar. I think once he found all that, he became more rooted and he got a lot more stable and a lot more contented, a lot more chill. The last thing I'll say about his youth is you can see that his eyebrows really straight across and the bottoms of his earlobes really flat as well. That shows that in his youth, he was really stubborn. He really wanted to go his own way, especially with those wide splayed ears, that more mercurial, triangular sort of face. He seems like he would have been kind of a rebel. But as you can see in his older age, no flat eyebrows, no flat bottoms of the earlobes. He's much more stable. He's chilled out, and it's not about his way anymore. It's about God's way, which is what we all need to strive towards. Alright, so that concludes my physiognomy analysis of St. Padre Pio. Very fascinating figure, someone that I've always been interested in. Haven't looked too deeply into him and his life, but I've heard a lot about him from my Catholic friends, and I think that he's really a fascinating figure. He's been requested a few times, and I figured, you know what? I've been doing all these grisly, nasty Halloween specials. It's All Saints Day. Let's throw out something nice, something good, something wholesome, something good for the soul, rather than all this nasty attention-grabbing stuff. And if you guys like this, no spoilers, but you guys are going to love my Christmas special. I'm doing a little 12 Days of Christmas thing with 12 people from the Bible. Who might it be? You're going to have to stay tuned to find out. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video with someone you think will be interested in. If you want to get a face reading done for yourself or someone you know, check out my website. Link is in the description. And if you want to get a full education on physiognomy and how all that works, you can subscribe to my Patreon. There I upload exclusive videos on physiognomy, taking you through a whole college-style academic course on physiognomy with different lessons and some of the material that I've created and use in my own practice for my own clients. We also have a Discord where you can ask me questions anytime about whatever you want. This has been Taylor from Phenotype Insights, reminding you to always judge a book by its cover. Thank you for watching.